The next presenter is Dr. William Roberts. Dr. Roberts has been on the medical staff at Northwestern Medical Center in St. Albans and at FAHC in Burlington for over 20 years. He's currently the medical director of Northwest Medical Center Comprehensive Pain Management Program in St. Albans. And in doing so, he works to improve access to services for pain management and narcotic addiction for Franklin and Grand Isle counties. I've had an opportunity to speak with Dr. Roberts in the past, and I think I can just briefly sum it up like this. He gets it. He understands what the issues are. He understands the challenges facing law enforcement. He understands the scope of the addiction issue, and he understands that this is not something that law enforcement can just simply arrest its way out of. You have to have multiple tracks going. Law enforcement, meaningful and effective rehabilitation and treatment, and understanding by the treating physicians. So, Dr. Roberts, thank you for joining us today.
Colonel Lesperance is used to me being theatrical. All rise, please, to join me for my introduction. We'll do the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now you get used to me also being very clear-cut because I mostly spent time up to this point saying the Pledge of Allegiance with Boy Scouts. My two sons are Eagle Scouts, and a great deal of what I've learned over the years about making impressions on people is based on the idea that you have to capture imagery that is appropriate for the topic. I think our right and lefts are right here. Just which one is advanced? Somebody give me a hint on. Arrow to the right, okay. So as personal freedom, liberty and justice for all, personal freedom conflicting with justice for all. These are the concepts that I'm going to discuss with you very briefly. And the tie-dye, by the way, I was yesterday canvassing in Alberg, and I went into a shop to speak to the owner of the shop. He had this coat. He asked me questions that were on my slides today because people are interested in this topic of marijuana. And as I talk to people, they ask me good questions, questions that I'm going to now present you the answers to. Leadership is emerging in Vermont, leadership for the country in healthcare and in this topic of what do we do with marijuana, how do we make sure that we're not going to reproduce the premature decision-making and injudicious application of new personal freedom obligations imbalanced with the armamentarium that's going to allow us to address the consequences for the criminal justice system. Now, in the right-hand corner just appeared one of the cannabinoids, or if you want to put the emphasis on the other syllable, you could say cannabinoids. We struggled with that earlier. I take advantage of putting it up there. You'll see 17 of these. There's 47 others that I'm aware of. So let's not be confused about how do we tell these things apart. We can tell these things apart. They're very clear-cut. They're all different molecules. They're identifiable. And we have the ability to identify them and understand which ones are active, which ones are psychoactive, which ones cause psychomotor retardation, and which ones are relevant for compromising people's ability to drive their vehicles. But there's a lot of them. Now, I graduated from college in 1978. At my commencement address was Gary Trudeau, the speaker. And Gary's still drawing cartoons, and Zonker Harris is still an icon, an archetype, or a stereotype, depending on which side of social circumstances you happen to be sitting on. But I like this frame. This came out the day that Greg asked me if John Philippek asked me if I would be involved with this presentation. This frame was in the Sunday paper. So I clipped it out because I thought it was topic appropriate. But propaganda is important to recognize and distinguish from factual information. I'll tell you what, the public is not interested in propaganda statements or ideas that can't be substantiated with fact and connected to outcomes. So in 1936, there was a movie that was produced about a trio of drug dealers who are leading young people to a life of addiction to reefer, resulting in them participating in parties with wild jazz music. Can you imagine? I mean, that's a tragic outcome, jazz music caused by marijuana. But In fact, Reefer Madness is a cult classic. You can walk into any place that still has DVDs to rent and rent this movie, and I'd recommend that everybody who's got an afternoon to waste go ahead and do that. But the idea that permanent insanity and murders, unless you're one of the people trafficking in the marijuana, are connected to marijuana is a little far-fetched. I mean, that clearly was a propaganda statement in 1936. It still is. People do not become permanently insane using marijuana. But that's not the topic that you're here to discuss today. You're here to talk about traffic safety. But avoiding stereotypes and getting away from propaganda is a good idea. Now, originally, the plot for the movie was written entitled Tell Your Children. It was a message that parents were supposed to bring home to their children, because even in 1936, parents were struggling with the idea of how do I address this relationship between this substance, which is in my neighborhood, and my education of my children at my kitchen table. Now, the movie got purchased, and although it was originally financed by a church group, it was turned into a very accurately, or I should say a very poignantly directed misrepresentation. But the reason I pull it out and make a couple of slides out of it today is it's the very first depiction in cinematic forums of a motor vehicle accident resulting as a result of at least minimal impairment with marijuana. So there's a scene in the movie which you can watch where the driver runs over the pedestrian, and it's, as far as I can tell, the first representation of that activity being in a public setting. Now, yesterday when I was in the tie-dye shop talking to a guy in Alberg about these ideas, he challenged me on this. He says, isn't it true that people drive slower when they're intoxicated with marijuana? And so I'm going to run you through some information. But what are the newest data? The newest data on drug driving statistics, if you look at the NHTSA data, well, that's great. You divert people off the highway, you swab their cheek, you tell them whether or not they had a substance that you can distinguish between the afternoon and the evening, and those things are all true. But it's, I think, more interesting to say, okay, now I'm deceased. What's in my bloodstream? Isn't that really what we're interested in knowing? Not, you know, what percentage of the housewives that I diverted into a parking lot in Pennsylvania, which I recognize is ridiculous, and I'm very sorry about that. It's tragic. It was a ridiculous lawsuit. But the idea that Brady and Lee could publish this year, not in press yet, so you can't get this in printed form, but here's the data as close as I can come to understanding its most recent publication. This is not available in press, but it has been released. Brady and Lee studied alcohol and other drugs detected in drivers who died within 1 hour of a motor vehicle crash in 6 states. And I'd like to have our state be number 7 if we could organize that. And they do toxicological studies on the decedent, the driver. So if there's a dead passenger, that doesn't count. We're not interested in that. And if there's a dead pedestrian, or another vehicle, pedestrian or passenger, we're not interested in that. But it's pretty good numbers. 23,591 dead people had their serum studied. And as I said, they're neglecting some of the relevant parties. But this is going to be in press in the Journal of Epidemiology. This is an advanced access release that I got through SAMHSA. So as a participating provider in drug treatment programs, I get all this literature that comes in my direction before it hits the press. And it's pretty good stuff a lot of the time. I'm going to reference another one in a few minutes. So what does it say? What does it tell us? Of those people studied, yes, alcohol is still very relevant, with 39.7% of the decedents being positive for alcohol. But look at the other 28.3%. You know, these numbers are not theoretical. These are dead people's serum that have been pressed through high pressure gas chromatographer. These are the facts. And the prevalence of positive results for alcohol, pretty good, remain stable. They're not really changing very much. But the prevalence for the non-alcohol drugs has risen from 16.6 to 28.3% in this interval from 1999 to 2010. Now, those of you that don't know me very well, I did not become a lawyer because I can do the math. I couldn't be a lawyer, but if you extrapolate that forward you're going to eclipse a number something like 30% today if the curvilinear progression that you can demonstrate with those data are actually consistent and continuing to go up. The age and sex data are not showing trends. So non-alcohol drugs, look at this, all groups, all ages. Let's not pick out the 22-year-olds because that's not what's going on in my clinic. That's not who I'm treating for substance abuse. It's everybody. And that's the way we need to think about this. This is not going to be an age, gender, or socioeconomic class-related topic. Now, where's the motor vehicle data headed with regards to marijuana? It's the most commonly detected drug already. It's clearly going to be increasing 4.2% in 1999, 12.2% in 2010, and that P0001, that means there's one chance in 100,000 that happened by accident. That's an increase. Nothing about that suggests that it isn't true. And I did a little playing around with their graphs and matched it, and I got a single exponential acceleration curve that would represent that data. It tells me that in 2014, if the data that was being replicated is still progressing at that pace, we're at 30% in 2014. So, is alcohol in the back seat? Yeah, I think we're already there. I don't think we should be thinking about this in theoretical terms. I don't think that we should back off on alcohol any more than I think we should back off on trying to prosecute heroin dealers or people who are distributing opiates in Vermont. The idea that you all are doing your jobs and doing it well is clearly in my mind, and I think that this question of what do you do when alcohol becomes the backseat drug? 1/3 of the driver fatalities are connected to substances, but we have the opportunity to look at things now and think about them and talk about the new alcohol and think about how do we interact with our society and influence their decision making, determining whether or not it might be possible to have the consumer of the new alcohol have a different ethical bearing with regards to the rest of society than alcohol users have with the rest of society. And I think this is a worthwhile argument to make. The key is to avoid reproducing concepts of alcohol impairment. And per se, 501, please raise your hands, the legislators. I'll thank you again for the Judiciary Committee moving forward 501, and I'll be calling my representatives, that's for sure. Well, I won't have to call them, I'll see them. But the idea that should become a law is very clear in my mind. If we speak to the topic, though, with a voice that connects personal responsibility, personal freedom, and avoid the alcohol per se format of defining impairment, I think we encourage more responsible behavior. We can educate our society to behave differently, regardless of what the substance is, because it's not just marijuana that we're talking about here. This is thousands of substances, all of them resulting in at least minimal impairment. So what's changed since the 70s? So I put my my tie-dye jacket on, I get out a cartoon about Zonker, and I talk about Gary Trudeau coming to my college graduation. But this is not your mother's marijuana we're talking about. So we'll go ahead and talk about marijuana a little more, just because there's some good data available and there's some appendicular concepts that I want to get across. The product itself has changed in several ways. First of all, the price corrected for inflation is down. Well, so is heroin, but marijuana also is down, corrected for inflation price as compared to my graduating class from college. The availability is greater and the potency is not the same. So in case you forget to notice, I'm now defining marijuana as a product. I'm titling my slides with the word product because in Washington State and Colorado, it is a product, and people compete for the opportunity to secure the customer's attention and sell that product, and potency is one of the ways that they sell the product. So normally we talk about THC concentration as a percent of dry weight of the material that's being studied, and that's not always dry weight, so you may be weighing the amount of marijuana or THC, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, in an oil substrate, hashish oil or other products, or it might be in the form of a brownie, in which case it's percent weight of brownie, 8-ounce brownie, you got to figure that out. But you get the idea. The average THC concentration when I graduated from college was somewhere in the range of 3% by dry weight. And now marijuana generally is thought of as 1 to 5% by dry weight, hashish being 5 to 15, and hashish oil 20%. Again, that's not dry weight, but it actually is dry because there's no water in the oil, so it is a dry weight. But here's the thing, the same guys that I graduated from college with, some of them are PhD level horticulturalists, and they know how to grow plants. I mean, this is an agrarian state and society that I live in. And so the ability to take a sterile, female, unpollinated Sensimilla variant of marijuana and grow it, and then remove those buds and have the dry weight concentration of those products, remember I'm calling them products, at 17% is considered to be good business. That's good business. So we're making a product that's 4 times more concentrated than the one that people identified with in my age group in college, and we're getting that out of a plant with no processing. We didn't have to concentrate it. We don't have to cook it down or boil it or do anything to it. That's the way it comes off from the stock. Now, what's the concentration of the product? Well, the Mississippi Potency Monitoring Project of 1983 gives us that information. They arrest people, they take away their marijuana, they burn it, and they tell you how much is the THC concentration in it. So it's been climbing for decades, and predictably, you would expect it to continue to rise in an open marketplace because, again, people are competing for the customer. Their product has to be better, more concentrated, higher potency than the other guy's product. And the dry weight in 1983 was under 4%, and this is all the Mississippi data. 2007, 7.3%, 2008, 10%. Currently, concentrations of some products are eclipsing 30%. Now, I will tell you that you can't do that horticulturally. You got to process your product if you're going to get over the 17, 18% mark. But products that are being confiscated and then analyzed in Mississippi are crossing over 30%. This is not your mother's marijuana. It just isn't the same game that people are familiar with. So we have a whole generation of people who have raised their own families, who graduated from college with me, and they have this sort of archetypical image in their mind of Zonker Harris and life with marijuana, and this is just not the same marijuana. So what are we going to do? Well, telling young people or anyone that the 10% concentration by weight average of the product, which is 3 times more potent than what their parents smoked, probably not an argument that is going to get their attention and be used in a profitable way, or so is the opinion of Dr. Brain in Maryland, who's a child psychologist whose quote I picked off the internet. I thought he had a cute idea here, that telling people that the product is more potent is probably not going to cause them to use it less avidly. That's not what he thought anyway, and it probably isn't. But we need to educate people. We need to prepare ourselves to be educators. Our society, as we struggle with these questions of what the legalities ought to be and the idea of entering into a society where there are a new set of access points and boundaries, has to be linked to preparation to provide people with objective, non-stereotype, non-propaganda statements of fact. Now, psychomotor retardation in driving, I don't think that I'm going to get challenged by anybody on the idea that it is a true statement, that when you consume delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which I'm going to now refer to very specifically because that's the active ingredient. We're not talking about marijuana, which has 4,000 other compounds in it. I'm just talking about delta-9 THC. It impairs your driving, and your performance in driving can be measured in any number of ways. I kept some slides at the end that reference the after 2008 literature on this topic. I went digging around to find not the old literature about driving in go-karts and things like that, or with weird goggles on, but stuff that's coming out in the last 6 or 8 years, most of which is after 2012, interestingly, it definitely interferes with your driving performance, your response times are longer, and this is one of the quintessential arguments in favor of marijuana. Say, oh, I like to get a little toasted and I find it mellows me out and I drive slower. Well, that's great, but your vehicle still weighs 3 tons. So you go 15 miles an hour slower, I'm sorry, but that's still deadly force when you multiply mass times velocity. It's not safer if you're organic and you have a body that you get in front of that thing that's going 15 miles an hour slower. So the idea that people will drive slower turns out to be factual. I don't know if that creates more of a hazard on the road if some people are driving slower than other people or not. All I know is it doesn't make them safe drivers. And the dose-response relationship is pretty clear. That is, you can measure blood concentration in serum studies, do high-quality analysis of the delta-9 THC active compound in serum under these circumstances, and people's dose-response relationships for the slowing, the psychomotor retardation, that's pretty well validated. There's nothing to argue about. Let's get into a couple of other ideas about what happens when you create new civil liberties. This is also not published. This is not in press yet. That'll be in press in sometime in August in the Annals of Emergency Medicine. So we have here different states with different levels of decriminalization of marijuana and how many calls are made about the 9-year-old and younger exposure to the product. So there's more to think about here than just the safety in behind the wheel. These are the data, but where's Vermont? So I highlighted in green this idea that the decriminalized states, which you'll notice include Vermont. Now, I don't know why the authors really thought that, because when I look at this, I don't feel like Vermont really fit into that category, but they included the calls from the poison centers from Vermont. So, like it or not, the authors of this investigation believe that we're a decriminalized state. And they put the phrase medical and or recreational with a slash. Now, in my clinic, I can tell you that that's a perfect place to put the slash, because the charade that medical marijuana is for the treatment of those oppressed by chronic pain only is a charade. When I ask people, so where do you buy your marijuana? I say, oh, I get it from Frank, he's got a permit. I don't have to deal with a criminal that way. Like, whoa, okay. That's the way you feel about it. It seems to me that Frank's not really holding his permit very credibly. But Frank becoming a drug dealer with a recreational dealership operating out of a medicinal permit for marijuana is frankly an end run. But the question is, how many of the brownies or products get into the stomachs of the 9 years and younger population that are actually from the Vermont part of this data? The transitional states of Arizona, Michigan, and Montana, New Mexico, Rhode Island, they can wait for us to tell them that later. But the product issues, it's all about the product. What do we want to think about when it comes to the product? I think we need to think about the product the way the authors of that emergency room study say. Well, the call rates are related to the increased use by family members and therefore the increased presence in the household and therefore the increased likelihood of ingestion, and the increased potency of the product is going to impact what the consequences of all that is. And here's your advice for the lawmakers in the room. State lawmakers should consider requirements such as child-resistant packaging, warning labels, public education, which I highlighted in red because I'm all about education, when drafting legislation to reduce the risk to others. And the authors are talking about children, but I'm saying all others. So those things, those same statements, the packaging, the warning labels, the education, will protect our society, not just the children in our society. So getting to the per se argument and what do you do with the testing and the cost of all this. So that's your most common variation of the chemical structure for delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. This is the most transient of all the metabolic byproducts that you go through very quickly. Within an hour and a half of getting delta-9 THC through your liver, you're producing a lot of this second substrate. But the 11-nor-9 carboxy-delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which is one of your cannabinoids or cannabinoids, depending on how you want to pronounce that, is this one. And so that's what everybody's talking about finding in your urine later. It's very confusing to everybody but me, I think, that I don't care what's in your urine later that has no activity. I want to know how much delta-9 THC is in your serum when your car's upside down, or somebody else's car's upside down. That one's not relevant. The one that's relevant is the one on the top. So parent drug versus metabolite. We have to get ourselves wrapped around what do we do with the technological question of parent drug, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, and these other 400 products that are not active. And it requires more expense, but it removes the question of how long ago did you smoke that? Because it really doesn't matter actually how long ago you smoked that. What matters is how much is left and still active when you put someone else at risk. Now, I say let the buyer be aware, not beware, but be aware. You want to define the concentration, specify the age, buy outcome data, issue use permits that are linked to education, establish cultural norms. This is incredible. You have to establish cultural norms that avoid the obligation of getting somebody prosecuted. Keep away from the per se argument because you're not going to charge somebody who hasn't done it in the wrong way. And then create treatment programs, because in my population of narcotic addicts who are being treated for their narcotic addiction, I am stuck with 14% of them who are addicted to marijuana that I don't have a treatment program for. They do great. They get rid of their opiates. They're still in the program. They pee clean for everything but the cannabinoids. And what am I going to do? I'm going to throw those people who are not using heroin under a bus because they're smoking some dope? We struggle with this. So make sure you include treatment for those that are going to be addicted to cannabis, because 14% of people who regularly use cannabis are addicted to it. They cannot stop using it. And then let's make sure that the taxes exceed the costs to society. And don't forget the costs of lung cancer, because one of the indirect variable costs of liberalizing access to cannabis that is consumed by inhalation and burning the product before you inhale it is lung cancer rates, which are higher among marijuana smokers than among tobacco smokers if you can separate pure populations of those groups. So if you're going to start tallying up the indirect variable costs, make sure that the taxation on those products is going to cover all of the indirect variable costs. Now, minimal level of impairment. Minimal level of impairment. I got you all to stand up. We talked about liberty and justice for all. And I think the question of the minimal acceptable level of impairment is answered by one population. Ask that question. That's who you want answering that question. Let's not lose sight of what we're talking about here. People have bad things, very bad things happen to them, and there is no acceptable level that minimal impairment represents in my mind. Because I don't think that the families of the deceased are going to think that there's any level of minimal impairment that's acceptable. So when personal freedom policy collides with public safety, let's have both. Let's have both liberty and justice, not just more liberty. So those are the references that I picked out for the more recent psychomotor retardation data on the road safety stuff that I think is well away from the pantomime and previous poorly validated studies on psychomotor retardation. These are good studies, and I'd be happy to take any questions, or we could start lunch early.